Imagine the sound of the wind not as a harsh gust, but as a low, rhythmic breathing that has moved across the tall grass prairie for thousands of years. It is a sound that carries the scent of dry earth and sweet clover, a sound that fills the immense open spaces of the Kansas plains, where the horizon seems to stretch into infinity, underneath a sky that shifts from a dusty gold to a deep, bruised violet as the day draws to a close. To many who drive these long, straight roads today, the landscape appears as a vast vacancy, a quiet expanse of agriculture and grass that has remained largely unchanged since the dawn of time. But beneath the roots of the blue stem and the heavy silt of the riverbanks lies a secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about the heart of the North American continent. Deep time has a way of folding itself over the works of man, layering soil and silence over the echoes of the past, until a metropolis of 20,000 souls becomes nothing more than a whisper in the dirt. For generations, the residents of what is now Cowley County went about their lives, tilling the earth and watching the seasons turn, unaware that they were walking upon the rooftops of an empire. Every now and then, a heavy rain would wash away a layer of topsoil, or a plough would strike something hard and unnatural, a flint scraper, a beautifully worked arrowhead, or a fragment of pottery decorated with patterns that no one in the local towns quite recognized. These artifacts were often gathered in jars on kitchen windowsills or kept in cigar boxes in the back of barns, small tactile reminders that someone had been here long before the fences were strung and the iron rails were laid. The early explorers who moved through this territory in the 19th century noted the unusual density of these finds, but they lacked the tools to see the true scale of what was hidden. They saw scattered camps where there was actually a sprawling urban complex, a forgotten city that once rivaled the size of colonial settlements on the distant Atlantic coast. As you settle in for the night and let the weight of the day drift away, you are in the right place to explore these hidden corners of our shared past. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new history narrations every single day, weaving together the mysteries of the old world to help you find a peaceful rest. If you find these journeys into the deep past as soothing as I do, please consider subscribing so you never miss a nightly story, and perhaps leave a like to help other weary travelers find their way to our fireside. Now, let us return to the quiet plains and the people who once called this vastness their home. The people who built this hidden world are known to us as the Wichita, or more specifically, their ancestors who lived in a massive settlement they called Etzanoa. To the modern mind, the idea of a pre-Columbian city in the middle of the Kansas prairie feels like a dream, yet the evidence has always been there, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The Wichita were not nomadic wanderers, as the old textbooks often portrayed the people of the plains. They were master architects of the land, a settled and sophisticated society that understood the rhythms of the Walnut and Arkansas rivers. They lived in great beehive-shaped houses made of cedar poles and thick, fragrant grass, structures that could house large families and stay cool in the punishing heat of the prairie summer. The discovery of Etzanoa did not happen all at once, but rather through a slow, patient process of realization that spanned hundreds of years. It began with the journals of Spanish conquistadors, men like Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, who marched into the interior of the continent in the middle of the 16th century, driven by a feverish hunger for gold and the mythical 7 cities of Cibola. What they found instead was a kingdom they called Quivira, a place of incredible fertility and abundance, where the people wore fine skins and lived in villages that seemed to go on forever. Decades later, in the year 1601, an expedition led by Juan de Oñate encountered a settlement so large it took them 2 entire days to walk through it. They described thousands of houses and vast fields of maize, beans, and squash, estimating a population that reached into the tens of thousands. For centuries, historians treated these Spanish accounts with a certain degree of skepticism, assuming the explorers had exaggerated the size of the settlement to impress their patrons back in Europe. The physical remains of such a massive city seemed to have vanished into the tall grass. It wasn't until the dawn of modern archaeology that the true scope of Etzanoa began to emerge from the shadows of myth. Using techniques like radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic materials, and stratigraphy, the study of the various layers of earth deposited over time, researchers began to piece together a timeline of continuous occupation that stretched back over 8 centuries. They found that the soil was not just dirt, but a complex archive of human activity, rich with the charcoal of ancient hearths and the discarded tools of a thriving economy. As we look closer at the ancestral lands of the Wichita, we begin to see a landscape that was meticulously managed and deeply loved. The city was not a dense, cramped grid like the cities of Europe, but a sprawling, garden-like metropolis that integrated perfectly with the natural curves of the river valleys. It was a place of immense social complexity, where trade routes converged from every direction. Archaeologists have uncovered obsidian from the mountains of the west, turquoise from the deserts of the south, and seashells from the distant Gulf of Mexico, all resting quietly beneath the Kansas wheat fields. These items tell a story of a connected world, a hub of commerce and culture that flourished long before the first European ships sighted the American shores. The mystery of Etzanoa is not just in how it was built, but in how it managed to disappear so completely from the collective memory of the modern world. It is a reminder of the limits of what we know, and how much of our history is buried just inches beneath our feet, waiting for a curious mind or a shifting layer of soil to bring it back into the light. The Wichita people never truly left. Their descendants carry the stories and the spirit of Etzanoa with them today, but the physical city became a ghost, a shadow cast by the setting sun over the prairie. As the darkness deepens and the wind continues its long, slow journey across the plains, we can almost hear the muffled sounds of that ancient life, the rhythmic scraping of stone on hide, the laughter of children playing between the grass houses, and the rustle of the corn in the river breeze. There is a profound peace in considering the weight of these forgotten ages. The rise and fall of civilizations, the slow accumulation of dust over the works of thousands, and the enduring silence of the earth all point to a scale of time that makes our own worries feel small and distant. The soil of Kansas is a heavy blanket, protecting the remnants of a world that was once vibrant and loud, but is now perfectly still. As we move further into the story of Etzanoa, we will look at the specific clues that led to its rediscoveries, the iron cannonballs dropped by retreating soldiers, and the magnetic signatures of ancient fire pits deep underground. But for now, let yourself rest in the knowledge that history is all around us, cradled in the dark earth, waiting patiently for the morning. The prairie is vast, the night is long, and the city of Etzanoa sleeps on, tucked away beneath the roots of the grass and the turning of the stars. The dry, rhythmic scratching of a quill pen against parchment is perhaps the only sound that rivals the wind on the high plains, a lonely, persistent noise that sought to capture a world far too vast for ink to contain. In the late spring of 1601, Juan de Oñate, the governor of New Mexico, turned his back on the established Spanish outposts and led an expedition of over 70 men into the shimmering heat of the Great Plains. They moved with a heavy metallic clatter, a slow-moving caravan of armored soldiers, Franciscan friars, and more than 700 horses and mules, accompanied by heavy carts that groaned under the weight of their supplies. They were not merely explorers, they were seekers of a ghost. For decades, the Spanish imagination had been haunted by the legend of Quivira. a kingdom supposedly so wealthy that its kings napped beneath trees hung with golden bells that chimed in the afternoon breeze. They looked for the 7 cities of gold, those shimmering mirages of wealth that had lured men like Coronado into the wilderness 60 years prior, only to return with nothing but dust and disappointment. But Oñate was a man driven by the stubborn hope of the late Renaissance, the belief that the map of the world still held secrets that could elevate a man to the status of a god. As they pushed northeast from what we now know as New Mexico, the landscape began to shift, losing its jagged mesas and replacing them with an endless, rolling sea of tall grass. The soldiers watched the horizon, with eyes narrowed against the sun, seeing nothing for weeks but the occasional herd of bison. Great, dark clouds of life that moved across the earth with the sound of distant thunder. They were entering a space that European maps labelled as a void, yet it was a world teeming with its own ancient rhythms and unseen borders. The journey was long and grueling, the heat of the Kansas summer pressing down on their steel breastplates until the metal felt like a second burning skin. They followed the winding path of the Canadian River and then the Arkansas, moving deeper into a territory that felt increasingly alien, where the sky seemed to swallow the earth whole. And then, as they approached the confluence of the Arkansas and Walnut Rivers, the scouts at the front of the line came to a sudden, breathless halt. They did not find a city of gold, but what they saw was, in many ways, more profound, a sight that challenged their understanding of the savage wilderness they believed they were conquering. Stretched out before them, hugging the curves of the riverbanks for miles, was a sprawling metropolis of thatched, beehive-shaped houses. It was not a fortress or a temporary camp, but a settled, vibrant center of human civilization that seemed to have no end. The Spanish chroniclers, usually prone to exaggeration, found themselves struggling to find the words for the sheer scale of the place. They counted thousands of houses clustered in neighborhoods that were separated by fields of corn, beans, and squash, a green tapestry of agriculture that fed a population estimated at 20,000 people. This was Etzanoa. To the Spanish, it was the realization of the great settlement, a place they called the Rayados after the people who lived there. The name Rayados was a Spanish term meaning the striped ones, or the tattooed ones, and it described the striking appearance of the inhabitants who came out to meet the weary expedition. These people, ancestors of the modern Wichita and affiliated tribes, wore their history and their status upon their skin. Their faces and bodies were adorned with intricate, permanent markings, delicate lines and geometric patterns etched with charcoal and bone needles. To the Spanish soldiers, these markings were a source of both fascination and unease, a visual language they could not decode. The Rayados were a people of the sun, their lives intertwined with the cycles of the prairie, and they greeted the strangers with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hospitality. They offered the Spaniards cakes made of sun-dried plums and maize, gestures of peace from a civilization that had flourished in the heart of the continent for centuries before a single European sail had ever been sighted on the Atlantic horizon. As Oñate and his men moved through the streets of Etzanoa, they recorded details that help us reconstruct this lost world today. They described houses made of sturdy wooden frames covered in thick prairie grass, structures that were remarkably cool in the summer heat and warm against the winter chill. Each dwelling was large enough to house an extended family, and the air between the homes was filled with the scents of wood smoke, drying meat, and the sweet, earthy aroma of ripening corn. This was not the nomadic existence the Spanish had expected to find. It was a place of permanence, of stratigraphy, the layering of human life over generations. In archaeological terms, stratigraphy is the study of these layers, where the oldest stories are buried the deepest and the newest sit just beneath the surface of the soil. In Etzanoa, those layers were rich with the debris of a thriving culture, stone tools, delicate pottery shards, and the remains of vast granaries where the surplus of the harvest was stored against lean years. The Spanish noted that the rayados were master farmers, utilizing the rich alluvial soil of the river valley to create an agricultural engine that supported a population larger than almost any European city of the time. This was a sophisticated society with its own complex social structures, its own trade routes that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and its own deep understanding of the stars that wheeled overhead. The 7 cities of gold had been a myth, a fever dream of greed, but Etzanoa was a reality. A city built of grass, earth, and human ingenuity. It was a metropolis of the plains that had remained hidden from the modern world for 4 centuries, its memory preserved only in the dusty archives of the Spanish Empire and the oral traditions of the indigenous people, who eventually moved away, leaving their ancestral home to be reclaimed by the tall grass. As we imagine Oñate standing on a ridge overlooking the Walnut River, watching the smoke rise from thousands of hearths, we are reminded of the limits of our own historical memory. We often think of the center of the American continent as a vast, empty space until the arrival of the railroad. But the story of Etzanoa tells us otherwise. It speaks of a time when the prairie was a network of bustling urban centers, where the silence we hear today was once replaced by the laughter of children, the barking of dogs, and the rhythmic thud of stone pestles grinding grain. The Spanish presence in Etzanoa was brief, a flickering moment in the long span of deep time. Within a few days, tensions would rise, and the expedition would find itself retreating under a hail of arrows and the weight of its own misunderstandings, leaving the city to fade back into the mists of history. But the earth does not forget. Below the tilled soil of modern Kansas farms, the magnetic signatures of those ancient fire pits remain, tiny, invisible pulses of heat that still linger in the clay, waiting for the sensitive instruments of modern archaeology to find them. The iron cannonballs dropped by Oñate's men in their hurried retreat have spent 400 years sinking slowly through the loam, acting as silent markers of where the old world met the new. As the night deepens, we can almost feel the weight of those 4 centuries, the way the grass grows over the scars of the past, and the way the wind carries the faint, ghostly echo of a city that once was, and in the quietest part of the soul, still is. The expedition of 1601 was just the beginning of the end for Etzanoa, but for us, it is the beginning of a rediscovery, a journey back through the layers of time to a place where the horizon was not a boundary, but a home. To understand the scale of Etzanoa, one must first listen to the water. Long before the first surveyor's chain touched the soil of Kansas, the confluence of the Walnut and Arkansas rivers served as a natural heartbeat for the land. It is here, where the silver ribbons of current meet and merge, that the city found its breath. The geography was not merely a backdrop, it was a deliberate choice, a strategic masterpiece of the ancestral Wichita people, who recognized that water is the first and final architect of any great civilization. The settlement did not rise in the cramped vertical fashion of the old world cities across the sea. Instead, it breathed outward, an organic sprawl that defied the very notion of a boundary. Modern archaeology, through the careful study of stratigraphy, that patient peeling back of soil layers like the pages of a dusty book, tells us that Etzanoa covered thousands of acres. To a traveller approaching from the high plains, the city would not have appeared as a sudden wall of stone, but as a shimmering, golden extension of the prairie itself. It was a metropolis of the horizon, a place where the built environment and the natural world existed in a state of quiet, mutual consent. As we move closer in our mind's eye, the individual shapes of the city begin to emerge from the waving tall grass. These were the beehive houses, magnificent, rounded structures that seemed to grow directly from the earth. Constructed from sturdy poles of cedar or walnut, arched and tied with meticulous precision, they were then thatched with thick layers of prairie grass. These were not mere huts, but sophisticated feats of engineering, some reaching heights of 30 or 40 feet. In the summer, the thick thatch provided a cool, shaded sanctuary from the relentless Kansas sun, and in the winter, the golden walls held the warmth of the central hearth, the smoke drifting lazily upward through a small opening at the peak of the dome. The construction of a single house was an act of communal rhythm, a symphony of hands passing bundles of grass and lashing timber until the skeleton of the home was hidden beneath a coat of amber. When hundreds, then thousands of these structures were clustered together, the effect must have been hypnotic. A sea of golden domes swaying ever so slightly in the wind, a city that looked like a field of giant ripening grain. It was a soft architecture, one that left no jagged edges against the sky, reflecting a philosophy of living that favored harmony over conquest. Between these great grass cathedrals, the layout of Etzanoa revealed a sophisticated understanding of social space. This was not a chaotic jumble of dwellings, but a series of interconnected neighborhoods, each with its own character and purpose. Wide paths, worn smooth by the passage of thousands of moccasined feet, wound through the clusters of homes, leading eventually to vast communal plazas. In these open spaces, the pulse of the city was most palpable. Here the air would have been thick with the scent of drying maize and the rhythmic sound of stone tools against flint, a constant, low-frequency hum of a society in motion. The organization of the city followed the meandering curves of the riverbanks, stretching for miles along the bluffs. Imagine standing on a high point overlooking the Walnut River 400 years ago. You would see the smoke from 5,000 fires rising in thin, blue needles toward the clouds. You would see the extensive garden plots, the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash, carpeting the rich bottomlands in shades of deep green. These fields were the lifeblood of the 20,000 souls who called this place home, a sprawling agricultural belt that blurred the lines between the urban center and the wild plains beyond. There is a profound silence that settles over us when we contemplate the sheer footprint of this place. In an era when many European cities were cramped, narrow, and plagued by the shadows of stone walls, Etzanoa was a city of light and air. The distance between the furthest clusters of houses was so great that it took the Spanish explorers a full 2 days to traverse its length. They spoke in their journals of being overwhelmed by the scale, of the way the houses seemed to continue forever, tucked into every fold of the landscape and following every bend of the water. As we consider the layout, we must also consider what lay beneath the surface. The people of Etzanoa were masters of the earth, digging deep storage pits into the clay to preserve their harvests. These subterranean granaries, some the size of small rooms, acted as a hidden mirror to the city above, a silent, underground network of abundance that ensured the city's survival through the leanest winters. Today, these pits are often all that remain for the archaeologist to find, filled with the discarded fragments of daily life, broken pottery, stone scrapers, and the charred remains of ancient seeds. Each pit is a time capsule, a localized pocket of deep time that allows us to map the invisible boundaries of a home that vanished centuries ago. The city was also defined by its proximity to the great flint quarries. The geography of the region provided an abundance of high-quality stone, which the Etzanoans crafted into tools and weapons of remarkable beauty. This was a city of industry, as much as it was a city of farmers. The layout likely included specialized areas for flint knapping, where the sharp, rhythmic clack-clack of stone on stone provided a percussive soundtrack to the morning hours. The distribution of these stone flakes across the thousands of acres tells a story of a busy, productive population, a people who were deeply integrated into a vast trade network that stretched across the heart of the continent. And yet, despite its size and its thousands of inhabitants, Etzanoa remained a city of the grass. There were no monuments of granite, no grand arches of marble to withstand the slow erosion of the centuries. Its greatness lay in its transience, in the way it could be built from the earth and, eventually, reclaimed by it. The very materials that made it so comfortable and sustainable, the wood, the grass, the hide, were the same materials that ensured its eventual disappearance from the visible world. It was a metropolis designed to breathe with the seasons, a place that understood that even the greatest of human achievements is ultimately a guest of the land. As the years passed and the city grew, the neighborhoods likely evolved into distinct social hubs, perhaps organized by kinship or craft. We can imagine the children running through the tall grass between the houses, their laughter lost to the same winds that ruffled the thatched roofs. We can imagine the elders, seated in the shade of the eaves, watching the shadows of the clouds race across the river valley, knowing every curve of the path, every dip in the terrain. The geography of Etzanoa was a map of the soul, a physical manifestation of a people who saw themselves not as masters of the prairie, but as a vital, pulsing part of its very fabric. Even now, as we walk over the fields where the city once stood, there is a lingering sense of order beneath the modern soil, the way the ridges rise, the way the creeks drain into the walnut. These are the same features that dictated the placement of every hearth and every doorway. The city may be lost to the eye, but its skeleton remains in the shape of the hills and the flow of the water. We are walking through a ghost of a layout, a blueprint written in the earth itself, waiting for the patient observer to recognize the echoes of the 20,000 who once called this vast golden sprawl their home. The mystery of Etzanoa is not just in its disappearance, but in its quiet, sprawling existence. A city that proved a metropolis could be built without iron, without stone, and without the need to conquer the horizon. It was a place of immense scale and intimate detail, where the geography of the river and the geometry of the grass house met in a perfect temporary union. As the wind moves through the valley today, it still follows the same paths that once wound between the beehive homes, a silent traveller in a city that refuses to be entirely forgotten. Imagine the scent of drying prairie grass and wood smoke, a heavy, sweet perfume that would have hung over the river valley for miles in every direction. Long before the arrival of the horse or the steel plough, the air in Etzanoa was thick with the industry of 20,000 souls, a rhythmic hum of life that defined the heartbeat of the Great Plains. This was not a silent wilderness, but a dense, vibrating tapestry of human sound. The rhythmic thud of stone hoes striking the earth, the laughter of children playing between the rows of maize, and the constant melodic scraping of flint against hide. To walk through the city was to move through a sensory map of a civilization in perfect equilibrium with its environment. The social fabric of Etzanoa was woven with the precision of the grass mats that lined their homes, governed by a sophisticated understanding of labor and communal responsibility. In this thriving agricultural society, the roles of men and women were distinct yet deeply interdependent, forming the dual pillars upon which the city's prosperity rested. The women were the masters of the earth and the hearth, the keepers of the botanical knowledge that allowed such a massive population to flourish in a land of unpredictable weather. It was their hands that tended the vast gardens of maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters of indigenous agriculture, ensuring that the granaries remained full even in the leanest years. They were the architects of the domestic sphere, weaving the intricate thatch of the beehive houses and transforming raw bison hides into soft, supple garments. There is a quiet strength in the archaeological record of their work. The thousands of bone needles and smooth grinding stones that speak of a life dedicated to the sustenance and comfort of a vast community. Meanwhile, the men moved between the roles of hunters, toolmakers, and protectors. Their lives were dictated by the migrations of the great bison herds and the seasonal fluctuations of the river. To provide for 20,000 people required a logistical mastery that we are only beginning to grasp. They traveled in organized parties, venturing out into the sea of grass to bring back the protein that fueled the city's growth. In the workshops scattered throughout the settlement, they practiced the delicate art of lithic reduction, the process of chipping away at stone to create tools of incredible precision. The ground today is still littered with the evidence of this labor. Millions of tiny chert flakes, the discarded remnants of a time when the shaping of a stone was a vital act of survival. As the seasons turned, the individual labors of the household gave way to the collective spirit of the city. Life in Etzanoa was punctuated by grand communal gatherings and festivals that followed the celestial cycles. These were moments when the sprawling metropolis, usually a collection of intimate neighborhoods, transformed into a single unified entity. During the harvest moon, the smoke from hundreds of communal fires would rise together, merging into a single cloud that could be seen from the distant ridges. These festivals were more than just celebrations. They were the glue that held the social hierarchy together. They were times for the exchange of goods from far-flung regions, obsidian from the mountains, shells from the distant Gulf, and for the reinforcement of the oral traditions that carried the history of the ancestors into the present. The leadership of Etzanoa was embodied in the local chiefs, men of influence who occupied a complex position within the social structure. Unlike the absolute monarchs of Europe, these leaders ruled through consensus and the redistribution of wealth. The archaeological evidence suggests a society that was remarkably egalitarian for its size, yet organized enough to execute massive public works. The chiefs were the navigators of the city's social currents, mediating disputes and coordinating the defense of the valley. Their authority was not marked by stone palaces, but by the respect they commanded and the wisdom they shared during the long nights of storytelling. One can imagine them seated around the central fires, their voices low and steady, recounting the origins of their people while the embers glowed like fallen stars against the dark Kansas earth. The daily life of an Etzanoan was a choreography of movement and stillness. In the early morning, as the mist rose from the Walnut River, the city would wake to the sound of birds and the first crackle of cooking fires. There was a profound order to this existence, a sense of belonging to a place that felt eternal. The smells of the city were a complex layering of the natural and the man-made. The sharp tang of fresh cedar, the earthy aroma of damp clay being shaped into pottery, and the savory scent of roasting meat. It was a metropolis of the senses, where the boundaries between the human world and the natural world were porous and thin. As the years passed and the generations folded into one another, the social structure of Etzanoa remained resilient, a testament to the stability of their way of life. The city was a living organism, constantly repairing itself, growing and receding like the very grasses that provided its shelter. There is a haunting quality to the thought of such a vibrant society existing for centuries, only to vanish into the whispers of the prairie wind. We look at the stratigraphy, the layers of soil that act as a timeline of human occupation, and we see the evidence of their success in the sheer density of the artifacts left behind. Every broken shard of pottery is a fragment of a conversation. Every charred seed is a memory of a meal shared in the warmth of a grass-walled home. What did they think of the future, these people who built a city of 20,000 in the heart of the continent? Did they imagine that their metropolis would one day be a mystery debated by scholars in a world they wouldn't recognize? Or did they live entirely in the expansive present, focused on the rhythm of the seasons and the immediate needs of their kin? The social hierarchy of Etzanoa was built on the idea of continuity, the belief that the path walked by the ancestors would be the same path walked by the children. It was a world of profound certainty, where the structure of society was as reliable as the rising of the sun over the eastern bluffs. And so, the city thrived, a sprawling, humming center of trade and culture that defied the traditional definitions of what a civilization could be. It was a place where the individual was never truly alone, folded into the protective embrace of a community that stretched for miles. As we contemplate the daily lives of the Etzanoans, we are reminded of the limits of our own understanding. We see the outlines of their houses and the tools of their trade, but the inner lives of the people, their dreams, their fears, the specific cadence of their laughter, remain just beyond our reach, buried in the deep time of the Kansas plains. The sounds of the city have long since faded, replaced by the low lowing of cattle and the distant drone of modern machinery, yet the essence of Etzanoa lingers in the soil. It is a reminder that the history of this land is far older and more complex than the stories we usually tell. It is a history written in the earth, waiting for us to listen to the silence and imagine the bustling metropolis that once was, a city of grass and spirit, standing proud in the center of the world. If you were to press your ear to the dark, loamy earth of the Walnut River Valley, you might almost hear the rhythmic thrum of 1,000 wooden hoes striking the soil in unison, a steady, heartbeat-like pulse that once defined the lifeblood of this great metropolis. To understand Etzanoa, one must understand the soil, for it was not stone or steel that built this city, but the miraculous alchemy of water, sun, and seed. The people here were masters of the landscape, possessing an intimate ancestral knowledge of the seasons that allowed them to coax a staggering abundance from the prairie. They did not merely live upon the land, they choreographed its growth, turning the vast river bottoms into a tapestry of emerald and gold that stretched as far as the eye could see. At the heart of this agricultural mastery was a sacred triad of plants known throughout the Americas as the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. This was not simply a method of farming, but a sophisticated biological system that mirrored the harmony of the Etzanoan world. The corn grew tall and strong, its sturdy stalks providing a natural trellis for the climbing beans to wind their way toward the light. In return, the beans performed a quiet miracle beneath the surface, fixing nitrogen into the soil to feed the hungry corn, while the broad, prickly leaves of the squash spread across the ground like a living carpet. This dense canopy of foliage kept the earth cool and moist during the blistering Kansas summers, suppressing weeds and protecting the precious topsoil from the wind. It is a form of companion planting that modern science now recognizes as a pinnacle of ecological efficiency, yet for the Etzanoans it was a spiritual arrangement, a covenant between the people and the earth that ensured no one went hungry. The sheer scale of this cultivation is difficult for the modern mind to grasp as we look out over the fenced-off rectangles of industrial monoculture that dominate the landscape today. In the 1600s, the river valley was an unbroken sea of garden plots, expertly irrigated by a network of channels that diverted the life-giving waters of the river into the thirsty fields. The Etzanoans understood the subtle contours of the floodplains, utilizing the natural rise and fall of the water table to ensure their crops thrived even in years of drought. They were engineers of the riparian zone, shaping the very flow of the river to suit the needs of 20,000 souls. As the summer heat intensified, the air would have been thick with the scent of damp earth and ripening vegetation, a heavy, sweet perfume that signaled the coming of the harvest. But the botanical repertoire of Etzanoa extended far beyond the Three Sisters. Along the edges of the great fields, vast stands of sunflowers turned their golden faces toward the sun, providing oily seeds that were a vital source of energy and a brilliant yellow dye for their textiles. And then there was the tobacco, a plant of deep spiritual significance, grown in specialized plots with meticulous care. The smoke of the tobacco was seen as a medium for prayer, a way to send thoughts and intentions drifting upward into the realm of the spirits. To walk through the outskirts of the city would have been to move through a botanical wonderland, where every plant had a purpose, every root a story, and every leaf a place in the complex web of Etzanoan life. As the days shortened, and the first touch of autumn chill brushed against the tall grass, the city would transform into a hive of frantic, joyful activity. The harvest was not merely a chore, it was a communal celebration of survival and foresight. The abundance was so great that it far exceeded the immediate needs of the population, and it is here that we see the true sophistication of their society. To manage such a surplus, the Etzanoans utilized deep, bell-shaped storage pits, a method of subterranean preservation that functioned as a natural refrigerator. These caches, often lined with grass or bark, were dug into the firm clay of the bluffs, where the temperature remained constant and cool throughout the year. Archaeologists today find the remains of these pits scattered across the site, their dark organic fill standing out against the lighter subsoil like shadows of a forgotten pantry. Within these earthen vaults, the people stored thousands of bushels of dried corn, beans, and seeds, creating a massive strategic reserve that protected the city against the whims of nature. This surplus was the foundation of their power. It allowed for the specialization of labor, the flourishing of the arts, and the ability to host the great trade delegations that traveled from the far corners of the continent. It was a city built on the security of the granary, a civilization that had mastered the art of the long view, looking past the immediate horizon toward the winters yet to come. One cannot help but wonder about the quiet moments in those fields, the songs sung by the women as they gathered the squash, the laughter of children chasing birds away from the ripening grain, and the profound sense of peace that must have come from seeing the storehouses full. The soil of the Walnut River Valley remains some of the richest in the world, a deep, dark gift of the ancient glaciers and the meandering rivers. But the true richness of Etzanoa lay in the relationship between the people and the plants they tended. They did not see the land as a resource to be extracted, but as a living entity to be nurtured. As the shadows of the clouds drift across the modern fields of Kansas, we are left to contemplate the fragments of this lost agricultural empire, the carbonized seeds and the stained earth that tell a story of a people who once turned the prairie into a garden of such magnificence that it supported a metropolis in the heart of the wilderness. The silence of the fields today is a heavy thing, filled with the ghosts of 1,000,000 harvests. We find ourselves standing at the edge of a great mystery, looking down at the very dirt beneath our boots and realizing that it was once the floor of a vast green cathedral. The Etzanoans knew things about this land that we have long forgotten, secrets of the seed and the season that allowed them to thrive for generations without exhausting the earth. Theirs was a prosperity born of balance, a wealth measured not in gold, but in the golden hue of a ripened cob and the security of a full cache. In the hushed stillness of the evening, when the wind sighs through the modern cornstalks, one might imagine the rustle of the ancient varieties, the colorful, hardy grains that once fed a city of 20,000, standing proud and resilient in the center of a world that has since moved on. The sound of a flint knapper's stone striking a core of chert is a rhythmic, percussive pulse that echoed through the streets of Etzanoa long before the first horse ever set foot upon these plains. It is a sound that speaks of intent, of craft, and of a connection that reached far beyond the immediate horizon of the Walnut River. While the corn grew in the silty loam of the valley, the people of the city were looking outward, their eyes fixed on the distant blue lines of the mountains and the shimmering heat haze of the southern coasts. They were not a people isolated by the vastness of the prairie, rather they were the masters of it, the keepers of a gateway that linked the frozen forests of the north to the tropical warmth of the south. As the seasons turned, the city transformed into a sprawling, vibrant marketplace, a central node in a continental exchange network that functioned with the precision of a heartbeat. The wealth of Etzanoa was carried on the backs of its people and packed into sturdy containers, moving along trails that had been worn deep into the earth by centuries of travel. At the heart of this trade was the bison, the great wanderer of the plains. The Etzanoans were skilled hunters and processors, turning the bounty of the herds into a currency recognized across thousands of miles. They produced dried meat and tallow, preserved in such a way that it could sustain a traveler through the harshest winter or the longest trek. But perhaps their most valuable export was the bison hide, thick, durable, and tanned to a softness that made it prized by those living in the high, cold altitudes of the West. Imagine a merchant arriving at the outskirts of the city after months on the trail, his arrival signaled by the dust kicked up by his companions. He might have come from the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, carrying pouches of obsidian, that dark volcanic glass that fractures into edges sharper than any steel. This obsidian, born of fire and earth, was a luxury item, used for ceremonial blades and high-status tools that whispered of distant volcanoes and hidden valleys. Along with the glass came turquoise, the color of a summer sky, traded from the ancestral Puebloan peoples of the southwest. These vibrant blue stones, polished by hand, would find their way into the hair and onto the chests of the Etzanoan elite, serving as a silent testament to the city's reach. But the network did not stop at the mountains. As one wanders through the archaeological record, sifting through the layers of time and sediment, items appear that seem almost impossible for a city in the middle of Kansas. There are fragments of marine shells, their surfaces still holding a faint, pearlescent glow despite being buried for hundreds of years. These shells originated in the warm waters of the Gulf Coast, traveling up through the Mississippi and Missouri river systems, passed from hand to hand, village to village, until they reached the great Metropolis on the Walnut River. They were carved into gorgets and beads, worn as talismans that carried the essence of a distant, salty sea that most Etzanoans would never see with their own eyes. To the north, the trade routes stretched toward the Great Lakes, where the earth gave up its copper. This native copper, hammered cold into ornaments and tools, brought a metallic glint to the marketplaces of the plains. It is a staggering thought that a person standing in a garden in central Kansas might be wearing copper from the north, turquoise from the west, and shells from the south, all while eating corn grown from seeds that had their ancestral origins in the heart of Mexico. The city was a crossroads of the world, a place where the diverse riches of a continent converged and were redistributed. In the crowded spaces between the thatched houses, the air would have been thick with a symphony of languages. We often think of the ancient plains as a monolith, but the reality was a tapestry of linguistic diversity. Within the marketplaces of Etzanoa, one might hear the tonal shifts of Caddoan speakers, the soft consonants of Sioux traders, and the distinct dialects of those who had travelled from the desert southwest or the eastern woodlands. Communication was likely a blend of shared trade languages and the elegant, expressive movements of Plains Sign Language, a sophisticated system of gestures that allowed people from entirely different cultures to discuss the price of a hide or the quality of a batch of salt. There is a certain stillness in the archaeological evidence of these exchanges, a quiet dignity in the way a single piece of worked stone can tell a story of 1,000 miles. We find tools made from alibates flint, a distinctive, colorful stone found only in a small area of the Texas Panhandle. Its presence in Etzanoa suggests a regular, organized movement of materials across hundreds of miles of open grassland. These were not random encounters, but established routes governed by long-standing social contracts and perhaps even sacred traditions of hospitality. The city was a sanctuary for the traveler, a place where the dangers of the open road could be traded for the security of a warm fire and a full belly. As the years passed, the influence of Etzanoa's trade network likely shaped the very politics of the region. Wealth in such a society was not something to be hoarded in a vault, but something to be given away, a means of building alliances and ensuring loyalty. A leader's prestige was measured by the richness of the gifts they could bestow upon visitors. A cloak of fine bison fur, a necklace of Gulf shells, or a blade of obsidian that caught the afternoon light. This was a gift economy, where the act of exchange was as much about social bonding as it was about material need. It created a web of interdependence that spanned the continent, making the fate of the city on the Walnut River relevant to people living in the shadows of the mountains and on the shores of the Great Lakes. The scale of this operation required a sophisticated understanding of geography and timing. The traders had to know when the mountain passes would be clear of snow, when the rivers would be high enough for canoes, and when the bison herds would be in the right position for a large-scale hunt. They were naturalists and cartographers, carrying maps of the world in their minds, etched there by the stories of their elders and the hard-won experience of the trail. They navigated by the stars and the subtle changes in the vegetation, their lives governed by the slow, majestic rhythms of the natural world. And yet, for all its complexity, this entire network left behind no written ledgers, no inscribed tablets of debt and credit. The history of Etzanoa's commerce is written instead in the stratigraphy, the layers of soil that archaeologists carefully brush away to reveal the discarded remnants of the past. Each shard of pottery and each flake of exotic stone is a word in a forgotten language, a clue to a time when the center of the continent was a bustling hub of human activity. We look at these artifacts now held in the palm of a hand or displayed under glass, and we feel the weight of deep time, the realization that thousands of people lived, worked, and dreamed here, part of a world that was as interconnected and vibrant as our own, yet entirely different in its foundations. The mystery of Etzanoa lies not just in its size, but in its disappearance from the collective memory of the modern world. How could a city that was the center of such a vast and vital network simply fade away? As we trace the paths of the obsidian and the copper, we are reminded that even the most powerful civilizations are subject to the whims of time and the shifting patterns of the earth. The trade routes eventually grew silent, the marketplaces were reclaimed by the grass, and the languages that once filled the air were lost to the wind. But beneath the modern fields of Kansas, the evidence remains, waiting in the cool, dark earth. The turquoise still holds its color, and the obsidian still keeps its edge. They are silent witnesses to a golden age of the plains, a time when Etzanoa stood as a beacon of prosperity and a testament to the enduring human desire to reach out, to connect, and to trade the familiar for the unknown. In the quiet of the night, when the modern world feels distant and thin, one can almost hear the faint rustle of the ancient travelers, the footfalls of those who walk the long trails, carrying the treasures of a continent toward the great city that waited in the tall grass. Deep beneath the roots of the bluestem and the switchgrass, there exists a map of the stars that was laid down by human hands long before the first horse ever stepped onto the central plains. To understand Etzanoa, one must look upward, past the drifting clouds and into the velvet depths of the night sky, for the people of this great metropolis did not see themselves as separate from the cosmos, but as a vital, breathing part of its infinite clockwork. they lived in a world where the boundary between the earth and the heavens was as thin as the morning mist over the Walnut River, and every action, from the planting of a seed to the construction of a lodge, was an act of alignment with the divine. The rhythm of the city was dictated by the steady silver pulse of the moon and the unwavering path of the sun, forces that were not merely distant lanterns, but living ancestors who observed the unfolding of human history from their high, silent perches. As the seasons shifted, the people of Etzanoa gathered at the great council circles, those enigmatic earthworks that have puzzled archaeologists for generations. These were not merely places of governance or gathering, but sophisticated astronomical instruments, precisely engineered to capture the exact moment when the sun reached its highest point, or when the constellations pivoted into a new house. To the modern eye, these circles might appear as simple depressions in the soil, but through the lens of archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient people understood the sky, they reveal a profound grasp of celestial mechanics. The shamans and elders who designed these spaces understood the tilt of the Earth's axis and the subtle wobbles of the moon's orbit, and they carved this knowledge into the very skin of the prairie. When the light of the solstice morning struck a specific point within the circle, it was a signal that the cosmic balance had been maintained, a reassurance that the great cycle of life would continue for another year. The spiritual life of the city was a tapestry woven from gratitude and a deep, abiding respect for the creatures that shared this vast sea of grass. Central to this cosmology was the bison, the massive, shaggy titan of the plains that provided the people with everything they needed to survive. But to the Etzanoans, the bison was far more than a source of meat and hide. It was a sacred relative, a manifestation of the earth's generosity. Rituals were conducted with a quiet solemnity, often led by spiritual healers who could speak the language of the wind and the animals. These shamans moved through the city like shadows, their presence a bridge between the physical world and the spirit realm. They were the keepers of the community's memory, the ones who understood the medicinal secrets hidden within the roots of the coneflower and the sage, and the ones who could interpret the omens written in the flight of a hawk or the shape of a passing cloud. In the heat of the summer, when the air hung heavy and still over the thousands of thatched dwellings, the smoke from sacred fires would rise in thin, straight lines toward the blue vault of the sky. These fires were never merely for warmth or cooking. They were offerings, carrying the prayers and the breath of the people upward to the great mystery. There was a profound sense of reciprocity in every gesture. When a harvest of maize was gathered, the first and finest ears were set aside, not for consumption, but as a gift back to the soil that had nurtured them. This was a philosophy of abundance rooted in the understanding that nothing is truly owned, only borrowed for a time from the ancestors and the descendants yet to come. The city was a living prayer, a testament to the belief that human prosperity is only possible when it exists in harmony with the natural laws of the universe. As the years passed and the generations folded into one another, the spiritual landscape of Etzanoa became as complex and layered as the city itself. Within the quiet interiors of the lodges, away from the bustling trade of the plazas, the elders told stories of the time when the stars first fell to earth and became the flint that sparked their fires. They spoke of the Milky Way, not as a cluster of distant suns, but as a path of white flowers walked by the souls of the departed on their journey to the land of the morning star. These stories were the glue that held the 20,000 souls of Etzanoa together, providing a shared map of meaning in a world that could often be harsh and unpredictable. The spiritual healers played a vital role in maintaining this social fabric, using song, dance, and the rhythmic beating of drums to realign the spirits of those who had fallen into discord or illness. The significance of the council circles went beyond their astronomical alignments. They were the heart of the city's spiritual identity, places where the veil between worlds was thought to be at its thinnest. It is here that the community would gather to witness the great celestial dramas, such as a solar eclipse or the passing of a comet, events that were seen not as random accidents of physics, but as profound messages from the creators. In these moments, the thousands of voices of Etzanoa would fall silent, a collective breath held in the face of the infinite. The shamans would interpret these signs, guiding the people through times of transition and ensuring that the city remained in step with the cosmic dance. This was a science of the soul, a way of knowing the world that prioritized connection over conquest and observation over interference. Even the layout of the city seemed to mirror the patterns found in nature, with clusters of dwellings radiating outward like the petals of a sunflower or the ripples in a pond. There was a deliberate flow to the movement of people through the streets, a choreography that respected the cardinal directions and the flow of the river. To walk through Etzanoa was to move through a sacred geography where every hill and every bend in the stream had a name and a story, and where the spirits of the land were consulted before any new structure was raised. This deep-seated spirituality was the foundation upon which the city's material success was built. It provided the ethical framework for their trade networks and the social cohesion necessary to manage a population of such immense size in the heart of the wilderness. As the moon rose over the tall grass, casting long, liquid shadows across the earthen floors of the council circles, the people of Etzanoa would look up and see their own history reflected in the constellations. They saw the Great Bear and the Seven Sisters, and they knew that as long as these lights continued their slow, steady march across the heavens, their city would remain a sanctuary of life and light in the vastness of the plains. The gratitude they felt for the bounty of the prairie, the bison, the deer, the fertile soil, and the clean water was not a fleeting emotion, but a constant state of being. It was a recognition that they were part of something much larger than themselves, a grand unfolding mystery that began long before they were born and would continue long after their city had returned to the earth. In the quiet of the night, one can almost imagine the soft chant of a healer rising above the rustle of the wind, a sound that has lingered in the atmosphere for centuries, waiting to be heard. The spirituality of Etzanoa was not confined to temples or written texts. It was written in the stars, etched into the soil, and carried in the very blood of the people who called this place home. It was a way of life that honored the cycles of growth and decay, the balance of light and dark, and the eternal connection between the human spirit and the cosmos. And as we sit in the stillness of the present moment, looking back across the gulf of time, we find that the questions they asked of the stars are the same questions we ask today, reaching out into the darkness in search of a light to guide us home. The smell of acrid smoke and the sharp metallic tang of cold iron began to drift across the tall grass prairie in the late summer of 1601, marking a shift in the atmosphere that no ritual could soothe. Juan de Oñate, the Spanish governor, searching for the fabled 7 cities of gold, had finally reached the sprawling settlement of Etzanoa. But the awe of discovery was rapidly curdling into a heavy, suffocating tension. The Spanish soldiers, encased in their stifling breastplates and gripping the hilts of their rapiers, looked out upon a city that defied their understanding of the wilderness. A metropolis of thousands of thatched houses that seemed to ripple like a sea of golden hives across the bluffs. They were outnumbered by thousands, a handful of Europeans standing in the heart of a civilization that was as sophisticated as it was vast. The Etzanoans watched these strangers with a cautious, quiet dignity, their warriors standing ready but restrained, sensing that the balance of their world was teetering on a knife's edge. This uneasy peace might have held an island of diplomatic curiosity in the vast sea of history, if not for the presence of the Escanjaks. They were a nomadic people, fierce and mobile, who had guided Oñate across the plains while harboring a deep-seated, generational enmity for the settled people of Etzanoa. To the Escanjaks, the great city was not a marvel of architecture or trade, but a rival to be humbled, a storehouse of wealth and grain that represented a different way of life entirely. As the Spanish moved through the outskirts of the city, the Escanjaks began to slip through the shadows, their intentions far darker than those of the explorers they accompanied. They began to set fire to the circular homes, the dry grass and willow frames catching with a terrifying speed, sending plumes of grey smoke spiralling into the Kansas sky. The Etzanoans, seeing their homes engulfed and believing the Spanish to be the architects of this betrayal, withdrew into the deeper reaches of their territory, leaving the streets of their city eerily silent as the fires crackled in the wind. Oñate, realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, ordered a retreat toward the south, but the path back was no longer clear. The Etzanoan warriors, who had spent centuries perfecting the art of defending these river valleys, emerged from the landscape like ghosts rising from the earth. They were not a disorganized rabble, but a disciplined force defending their families and their sovereign soil. Thousands of archers took up positions along the ridges and behind the natural earthworks of the riverbanks, their bows carved from the resilient wood of the Osage orange tree. As the Spanish and their Escanjak allies attempted to withdraw, they found themselves funneled into a narrow corridor of conflict, a desperate rearguard action that would become known to history as the Battle of the Walnut River. The air was suddenly filled with the low whistle of thousands of arrows, a sound like a sudden summer rain hitting the dry ground. The Spanish responded with the thunder of their arquebuses, early firearms that relied on a glowing match to ignite a charge of black powder. The roar of these weapons was a sound the prairie had never heard before, a violent, artificial crack that echoed off the hills and sent birds scattering in panicked clouds. The smoke from the gunpowder mingled with the haze of the burning city, creating a surreal twilight world where vision was obscured and the only certainty was the rhythmic beat of the struggle. Despite the technological terror of the firearms and the 4 small cannons the Spanish had brought with them, the Etzanoans did not flee. They showed a resilience that shook the Spanish soldiers to their core, a fierce devotion to their home that proved far more potent than the steel of Toledo. The Spanish soldiers described the Etzanoan warriors as being of great stature and even greater courage, noting how they used their buffalo hide shields to deflect the rain of missiles, and how they moved with a fluidity that made them difficult targets for the slow-loading muskets. For hours the battle raged in the tall grass, a chaotic dance of fire and flint. The Spanish were forced into a defensive circle, their horses skittish and sweating as the arrows thudded into the earth around them. It was a moment where 2 worlds collided with such force that the ripples are still felt in the archaeological record today, where lead bullets and iron chainmail have been unearthed alongside the stone scrapers and delicate pottery of the Etzanoan people. These artifacts, found nestled together in the same layer of earth, tell a story of a day when the peaceful rhythm of a metropolis was shattered by the ambitions of men from across the sea. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, the Spanish managed to break through the encirclement, retreating toward the safety of the southern plains. They left behind a city that was scarred but not broken, a people who had successfully repelled a foreign invasion through sheer numbers and unwavering bravery. But the cost was immense. The psychological weight of the encounter lingered like a cold fog. Oñate and his men, who had set out to find riches, found instead a civilization so large and formidable that they realized they could never hope to conquer it with the forces they possessed. They spoke of the city in their journals with a mixture of fear and respect, describing it as a place where the houses were so numerous that it took 2 days to walk through them, a testament to a density of life that seemed impossible in the heart of the continent. Meanwhile, the Etzanoans remained in the aftermath of the smoke, looking out over the fields that had been trampled by horses and the homes that had been reduced to ash. They were a people of the earth, accustomed to the cycles of rebuilding, but this was a new kind of shadow, one that did not belong to the natural world. They began the slow process of cleaning the streets and tending to the wounded, their movements quiet and measured in the cooling evening air. The silence that followed the battle was perhaps more profound than the noise of the conflict itself. A heavy, expectant silence that wondered if the strangers would ever return. The resilience of the Etzanoan warriors had saved their city for a time, preserving their way of life for several more decades, but the encounter had introduced a fracture into the timeline of the Great Plains. We often think of the history of the middle of America as a vast, empty space until the arrival of the wagon trains. But the Battle of 1601 reminds us that the land was already ancient and deeply inhabited. It was a place of sophisticated geopolitics, of shifting alliances between nomadic and settled tribes, and of a military prowess that could hold its own against the most powerful empire in the world at that time. The Etzanoans were not merely victims of history. They were the masters of their domain, a people who understood the strategic value of their river junctions and the strength found in their sheer numbers. As the stars began to appear over the valley of the Walnut River that night, the fires of the city were mirrored in the sky above, a reminder of the fragility of all human endeavors and the enduring strength of the spirit that calls a place home. The Spanish would eventually return to New Mexico, their reports of the great city of the East dismissed by many as exaggerations or fever dreams of gold-hungry men. For centuries, the story of Etzanoa faded into the realm of myth, a ghost story told by explorers that few believed to be true. The tall grass grew over the sites of the battles, and the earth slowly reclaimed the stone tools and the iron fragments, burying the evidence beneath layers of silt and time. But the memory of that day, the day the prairie roared with the sound of cannons and the sky was darkened by arrows, remained etched into the landscape itself, waiting for a future generation to peel back the layers of soil and listen to what the ground had to say. As we linger in this moment of the past, we can almost hear the distant echoes of that struggle, the heavy breathing of men in armor, the rhythmic thud of feet on the sun-baked earth, and the quiet, steady murmurs of a city beginning to heal. It is a reminder that every inch of the world we walk upon has been fought for, lived in, and loved by those who came before us, and that even the greatest of cities can become a whisper in the wind if we forget to look for the traces they left behind. The story of Etzanoa is a story of endurance, a testament to a civilization that stood its ground against the unknown, and in the quiet of the night we can still feel the weight of their legacy, resting heavily and peacefully beneath the Kansas soil. A single rusted iron trade knife found inches beneath the topsoil often tells a more harrowing story than the grandest stone monument. It represents a moment of contact, a bridge between two worlds that would eventually lead to the quiet unraveling of a metropolis. As the 17th century progressed, the vibrant rhythm of Etzanoa began to falter, not with a sudden crash or a singular catastrophe, but with a slow, agonizing thinning of the air. The very density that had made the city a marvel, the 20,000 souls living in close harmony along the bluffs, became its greatest vulnerability. When the first European explorers and traders arrived, they brought with them unseen travelers, microscopic invaders that the immune systems of the Wichita people had never encountered in their thousands of years of isolation. Smallpox, measles, and influenza moved through the thatched beehive homes like a silent, invisible fog. In a city where life was lived so closely, where communal meals and shared labor were the fabric of existence, the spread was relentless. We can imagine the healers and the elders, masters of a deep botanical knowledge, looking upon these new ailments with a profound sense of helplessness as their traditional remedies failed to stem the tide. The population, once so robust that it could field thousands of warriors to meet Oñate's expedition, began to dwindle. The songs that once echoed from the riverbanks grew quieter, and the vast fields of maize, once tended by thousands of hands, began to see the encroaching shadow of the wild prairie grass. It is a somber reflection on the nature of deep time to realize how quickly a city can begin to lose its shape when the hands that maintain it are gone. The architecture of Etzanoa was organic, a beautiful synthesis of the earth and the sky. Their homes were crafted from arched saplings, woven together and covered in thick, fragrant bundles of blue-stem grass. These structures were warm in the biting Kansas winters and cool under the relentless summer sun, but they required constant care. They were living things, in a sense. As the population declined, the cycle of repair was broken. A hole in a roof would go mended. A support beam, weakened by moisture, would eventually give way. As the years passed, the survivors faced a difficult choice. The pressure was not only coming from the invisible threat of disease, but from the shifting geopolitics of the plains. To the north and east, other nations were being pushed from their ancestral lands by European expansion, creating a ripple effect of conflict and competition for resources. The Wichita people, ever resilient and pragmatic, began a long, slow migration southward. They were moving toward the Red River, toward the lands that would eventually become Oklahoma, seeking safety and a new beginning away from the ghosts of their great northern capital. The departure was likely not a single mass exodus, but a series of smaller movements over several decades. One family would pack their essential belongings, their ceramic pots, their flint tools, their sacred bundles, and slip away into the tall grass, followed by another, and then another. The great plazas, where thousands had gathered to trade and celebrate the harvest, were left to the wind. The fires in the hearths, which had burned continuously for generations, were allowed to grow cold. Nature is a patient architect, and it wasted no time in reclaiming what had been borrowed. The prairie is a sea of green and gold, and like the ocean, it smooths over the disruptions on its surface. Without the constant footfall of 20,000 people, the packed earth of the city's streets began to soften. Seeds carried by the wind found purchase in the rich, dark soil of the abandoned gardens. The wooden posts of the great houses began to return to the earth, aided by the dampness of the soil and the cycles of frost and thaw. Within a century, the towering grass had grown so high that a traveller passing by the Walnut River might never have guessed that a metropolis had once stood there. The thatch rotted away, becoming mulch for new growth. The stone tools and discarded pottery were slowly buried under layers of sediment and decaying vegetation, a process known in archaeology as stratigraphy, where time is literally measured in the accumulation of earth. 1 inch of soil might represent 100 years of silence. The silence of Etzanoa is not a void, however. It is a presence. It is the weight of a story that was almost lost to the archives of the forgotten. For a long time, historians looked at the accounts of the Spanish explorers with a skeptical eye, dismissing the descriptions of a city that stretched for miles as mere exaggerations or fantasies meant to impress the Spanish crown. They could not find the stone walls or the crumbling towers that usually signify an ancient city in the popular imagination. They forgot that a civilization can be great without being made of stone. They forgot that the most enduring things are often those that are most in tune with the environment. As we contemplate this disappearance, we are forced to confront the fragility of our own built environments. We live in a world of concrete and steel, believing our footprints to be permanent. Yet Etzanoa teaches us that even the most thriving center of trade and culture can be folded back into the landscape until it becomes nothing more than a whisper beneath the roots of the grass. The city didn't truly die, it transformed. Its people carried their culture, their language, and their memories southward, while the physical site entered a long period of rest, protected by the very earth that had once sustained it. The mystery of why it took so long for us to find it again lies in our own limited perception of time. We tend to look for the spectacular, the obvious, and the loud. But the history of the Walnut River Valley is a quiet one. It is written in the subtle undulations of the ground and the way the light hits the fields at a certain angle in the late afternoon. It is found in the microscopic traces of maize pollen trapped in the mud of the riverbed, and in the way the local legends persisted among the Wichita descendants, who never forgot where they came from, even when the rest of the world had. And so, the Metropolis became a ghost city, a place where the boundary between the past and the present is remarkably thin. When the archaeologists finally began to uncover the thousands of flint scrapers and the fragments of pottery, they weren't just finding artifacts, they were uncovering the evidence of a slow, dignified retreat. They were seeing the final chapters of a story that began with a flourish of urban life and ended with the quiet rustle of the prairie. The disappearance of Etzanoa reminds us that history is not always a steady climb upward. It is a series of pulses, expansions and contractions, breaths taken and breaths held. As the night deepens over the Kansas plains, one can almost hear the echoes of that ancient bustle, a phantom vibration in the soil that speaks of a time when the heart of the continent beat with the rhythm of 20,000 lives, all eventually surrendered to the patient, reclaiming embrace of the wild. A single rusted iron plowshare bites into the dark Kansas loam, turning over a century of silence with a rhythmic, mechanical sigh. In the decades following the great migrations of the 19th century, the memory of Etzanoa did not vanish so much as it dissolved, seeping into the groundwater and the storytelling traditions of the new arrivals. To the homesteaders who staked their claims near the confluence of the Walnut and Arkansas rivers, the idea of a sprawling metropolis beneath their boots felt like a ghost story, a whisper shared over porch railings as the fireflies began their evening dance. They spoke of the Great Settlement, a legendary place mentioned in yellowed Spanish chronicles that few had actually read, treated more as a frontier myth than a historical reality. The land was being reimagined, partitioned into neat, rectangular grids of corn and wheat, and in this new orderly world of fences and property lines, there was little room for a city that defied the known limits of the plains. As the years passed, the wild grasses were replaced by the budding streets of Arkansas City, a town built upon the very bones of its predecessor. The bustle of the 19th century pioneers mirrored the energy of the rayados who came before them, yet the two worlds remained strangers to one another. The settlers saw the land as a blank slate, a virgin territory, waiting for the touch of progress, unaware that they were merely the latest tenants in a high-rise of history. While they built their brick storefronts and wooden steeples, the artifacts of Etzanoa lay just inches beneath the surface, waiting in the dark, cool earth for a hand to find them. Every spring thaw and every heavy rain brought fragments of the past to the light. Broken bits of flint, smooth grinding stones, and shards of pottery that glimmered like jewels in the fresh furrows. By the early 20th century, a quiet movement of amateur archaeology began to take root among the local residents. These were not men of the academy, but farmers, school teachers, and curious children who walked the fields after a storm. They were practitioners of surface finds, the act of collecting artifacts that have been pushed to the top of the soil by erosion or agricultural tilling without the need for deep excavation. Thousands of these objects began to fill cigar boxes and glass display cases in living rooms across the county. There were scrapers used for cleaning buffalo hides, delicate arrowheads carved from colorful chert, and heavy stone mauls that still felt balanced in the hand. To the people of Arkansas City, these were Indian relics, charming curiosities of a vanished nomadic people, but they did not yet understand the sheer scale of what they were holding. They were looking at the debris of a civilization, not a campsite. The scattered remains of a neighborhood that once stretched for miles. Meanwhile, the academic community in the distant universities looked upon these local legends with a polite but firm skepticism. To the historians and anthropologists of the mid-20th century, the Spanish accounts of Oñate were often dismissed as Iberian exaggeration. It was a common belief that the explorers of the 1600s were prone to inflating their discoveries to impress the Spanish crown, turning small villages into golden empires to justify the cost of their expeditions. The idea of a city of 20,000 people in the heart of the American grasslands contradicted the established narrative of the time, which suggested that large-scale urbanism was restricted to the Mississippi Valley or the Puebloan Southwest. The Great Plains were viewed as a vast, empty transit zone, a place people moved through, but never a place where they built a sprawling, permanent capital. This skepticism created a long, quiet era of hidden history, where the physical evidence was present, but the intellectual framework to understand it was missing. Scholars relied heavily on stratigraphy, the study of rock and soil layers, to determine the chronological order of events. But without a systematic large-scale excavation, the shallow layers of the Kansas prairie remained unread. They looked for the monumental stone architecture of the Aztecs or the towering mounds of Cahokia, and finding none, they assumed the Spanish had simply hallucinated the magnitude of Etzanoa. The city became a victim of its own organic success. Because the rayados built with timber, thatch, and earth, their grandest structures eventually composted back into the soil, leaving no stone walls to crumble, only the silent chemical signatures of a massive population. As the 20th century matured, the gap between the local relic hunters and the professional archaeologists widened. The amateurs knew the land had something to say. They could feel the density of the finds, the way a single acre might yield hundreds of tools, but they lacked the technical language to prove it. They didn't have access to radiocarbon dating, the process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to pin a specific century to an organic fragment, nor did they have the satellite imagery that would later reveal the subtle depressions in the earth where great lodges once stood. And so, Etzanoa remained a phantom, a city of the mind that the modern world walked over every day without ever truly seeing. The streets of Arkansas City hummed with the sound of early automobiles and the chatter of commerce, while just a few feet below, the heavy silence of the 17th century held its breath, waiting for a bridge to be built between the myth and the dirt. There is a certain weight to this kind of forgotten time, a feeling that the landscape is heavy with secrets it is not yet ready to share. For nearly 4 centuries, the site was treated as a series of disconnected dots rather than a single massive picture. It was as if the world had forgotten how to look at the horizon and see anything other than a boundary. But the earth is a patient librarian, and it does not lose its books. It simply waits for someone to learn the right language to read them. The skepticism of the experts served as a veil, a protective layer of doubt that kept the site relatively undisturbed while the town above it grew and aged. In the quiet hours of a Kansas night, when the wind ripples through the wheat like a golden sea, one can imagine the frustration of those early amateur collectors holding a piece of worked flint and knowing, deep in their bones, that they were standing in the middle of something vast, something that the rest of the world had decided was impossible. The transformation of the site into farmland was perhaps the most effective disguise of all. To the casual observer, the rolling hills and river bluffs looked like a masterpiece of natural serenity, a pastoral idyll far removed from the complexities of urban life. Yet, this very soil was a complex tapestry of human activity, enriched by the waste, the fires, and the footsteps of thousands. The phosphorus levels in the ground, the subtle changes in the vegetation that grew over old refuse pits, the way the snow melted faster over the buried footprints of long-gone homes, all of these were clues that the academic world was not yet prepared to decipher. The lost city was not lost because it had moved or been destroyed. It was lost because the modern eye had forgotten how to recognize a city that didn't look like its own. And so, the mystery deepened into a comfortable obscurity. The townspeople of Arkansas City continued their lives, the farmers continued their harvests, and the academics continued their lectures, all while the ghost of Etzanoa watched from the shadows of history. It would take a new kind of curiosity and a series of unexpected technological breakthroughs to finally pierce the veil. But for a long time, the only ones who truly knew the city were the ones who lived on top of it, the ones who felt a strange, unexplainable connection to the dirt beneath their fingernails, sensing that the story of the American heartland was far older and far more crowded than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The silence was not an end, but a long, slow inhalation, a gathering of strength before the truth would finally break the surface. The truth began to reveal itself, not through the swing of a pickaxe, but through the quiet turning of a page. For centuries, the journals of Juan de Oñate had been studied by historians, yet their secrets remained locked behind layers of poor translation and a fundamental misunderstanding of the terrain. The words were there, inked in the 17th century, but they were like a blurred reflection in a darkened mirror. It took the patient, meticulous eye of Dr. Donald Blakesley, an archaeologist at Wichita State University, to realize that the maps and descriptions provided by the Spanish soldiers were far more accurate than anyone had previously believed. He went back to the original manuscripts, retranslating the archaic Spanish with a focus on the specific distances and landmarks mentioned by the explorers. As he worked, a new picture began to emerge, a map that did not point to a mythical city of gold, but to a very real, very massive settlement at the confluence of the Walnut and Arkansas rivers. The Spanish had described a place of thousands of houses, a metropolis that stretched for miles, and as Blakesley aligned their ancient observations with the modern geography of Kansas, the scales began to fall away. He realized that previous researchers had been looking in the wrong places because they hadn't trusted the precision of the men who were actually there. But the land remembers what the maps forget. The curves of the river, the elevation of the bluffs, and the distance between the ravines all began to hum in harmony with the 400-year-old documents. To see what lay beneath the tall grass and the tilled soil of the Great Plains, the researchers turned to the invisible light of technology. They employed LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a sophisticated tool that pulses laser light from an aircraft to create a high-resolution 3D map of the ground. It is a way of seeing through the vegetation, of peeling back the skin of the earth to reveal the skeletons of long-dead structures. Through LiDAR, the subtle undulations of the Kansas landscape began to speak. They saw the faint outlines of ancient clusters, the ghosts of circular dwellings, and the remnants of a vast urban sprawl that had been smoothed over by centuries of wind and farming. It was as if the city of Etzanoa was slowly developing like a photograph in a dark room, its borders stretching far beyond what anyone had dared to imagine. A footprint that covered thousands of acres. Yet even with the maps and the lasers, the skeptics required something more tangible, a physical anchor to the past. They needed something that could only have come from the Spanish expedition of 1601. In a quiet field, a local high school student working with the archaeological team uncovered a small, rusted piece of metal. It was a horseshoe nail, but not just any nail. Its specific shape and composition were identical to those used by Spanish colonial blacksmiths 4 centuries ago. Shortly thereafter, the team discovered small iron cannonballs, the very munitions described in the Spanish accounts of a skirmish with the local inhabitants. These were not items that could have been traded or moved by chance. They were the discarded fingerprints of a specific moment in time, the debris of an encounter that had been written about in the journals and then forgotten by history. These artifacts acted as a bridge across the abyss of time. The horseshoe nail was a tiny, oxidized witness to the arrival of European steel in a world of stone and bone. It confirmed that the Spanish had indeed stood on this exact ground, looking out over the same river valleys that the archaeologists were now surveying. The matching of the physical landscape to the Spanish maps was so precise that it felt less like a discovery and more like a homecoming. The great settlement was no longer a ghost story or a tall tale told by weary conquistadors. It was a sprawling, breathing reality that had simply been waiting for the right moment to be recognized. As the excavations continued, the sheer scale of the site began to weigh on the researchers. This was not a small village or a temporary camp, but a metropolis of 20,000 people, a population density that rivaled many European cities of the same era.
They found evidence of vast communal granaries and intricate social structures, all hidden just inches beneath the surface. Using magnetometry, a process that measures the magnetic pull of the soil to find burned earth or dug pits, they mapped out thousands of storage pits and hearths without ever lifting a shovel. It became clear that the entire region was a continuous tapestry of human life. The ground was saturated with the remnants of daily existence, the charcoal of old fires, the discarded flakes of flint from tool-making, and the broken shards of pottery that once held the harvest. The discovery challenged the very foundation of how we view the history of North America. We are often taught a narrative of a vast, empty wilderness, a silent continent waiting for the arrival of the West. But Etzanoa tells a different story, a story of a loud, vibrant, and densely populated world that existed long before the first permanent English colonies were ever dreamed of. It was a world of trade networks that stretched across the plains, of complex diplomacy, and of a deep, sustainable relationship with the land. The archaeological breakthrough was not just about finding a lost city, it was about recovering a lost chapter of the human experience, a reminder that the soil beneath our feet is thick with the memories of those who came before. In the quiet of the Kansas twilight, as the wind ripples through the wheat fields, it is now possible to look across the horizon and see the silhouettes of 20,000 people. You can almost hear the low murmur of a city in motion, the sound of children playing between the thatched houses, and the rhythmic thud of stone tools. The mystery of Etzanoa was never that it had vanished, but that we had lost the ability to see it. Through the fusion of ancient texts and modern science, the veil has been lifted, and the great metropolis of the plains has stepped out of the shadows of myth and into the light of history. The silence of the plains is no longer an empty one. It is a silence filled with the weight of a civilization that flourished, endured, and eventually faded, leaving behind only the subtle clues that we are finally learning to read. As the researchers sift through the dirt, they are finding that the stratigraphy, the layers of soil that act as a timeline of the Earth, holds a complex record of climate shifts and human adaptation. They look for markers like the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling thousands of years ago, to understand the deep history of the region. But the story of Etzanoa is much more recent, a vibrant peak in the long human occupation of the heartland. Every radiocarbon date, a method of determining age by measuring the decay of carbon isotopes, confirms that this city was at its height, just as the medieval world was transitioning into the modern era. It was a bridge between epochs, a place where the old ways of the plains met the first ripples of global change. The work is slow and methodical, a patient conversation with the earth. There is no rush to uncover everything at once, for the city has waited 400 years to be found, and it can wait a little longer to be understood. Each small find, a bead, a scraper, a charred seed, is a syllable in a long-lost language. And as the scientists and historians piece these syllables together, the story of Etzanoa grows richer and more profound. It is a reminder that our understanding of the past is always evolving, always subject to the arrival of a new perspective or a more sensitive tool. We are never truly finished with history. We are only ever in the process of remembering it. The earth has a remarkable memory, though it speaks in a whisper that requires a patient ear to hear. Beneath the tall grasses of the Kansas prairie, the soil holds tight to the debris of 1,000 lives, preserving the fragments of a world that refused to be forgotten. When archaeologists began to sift through the dark, rich earth of the Walnut River Valley, they were not just looking for objects, they were looking for the heartbeat of a metropolis. Among the most telling whispers from the ground are the small triangular stone points known as Gaza points. To the untrained eye, they are merely sharp bits of flint, but to those who study the movement of ancient peoples, they are a map. These delicate tools, meticulously flaked from stone, connect the people of Etzanoa to the vast trading networks of the Great Plains and the Southwest. They represent a specific moment in time, a signature of a culture that was both settled and deeply connected to the world beyond its borders. Beside these points lie the scrapers, sturdy curved tools used for cleaning hides. They are smooth in places where a human thumb once pressed down with rhythmic, steady force, day after day, year after year. To hold one is to feel the phantom pressure of a woman's hand as she worked in the soft light of a late afternoon 400 years ago, preparing the robes that would keep her family warm through the biting prairie winter. As the excavation progressed, the earth began to yield the remains of domesticity, the quiet, everyday items that turn a location into a home. Thousands of pottery shards have been recovered, pieces of a puzzle that show a sophisticated understanding of fire and clay. These vessels were not merely functional, they were canvases. The Etzanoans decorated their jars with intricate patterns, sometimes using their fingernails to press delicate crescents into the wet earth before it was hardened in the coals. The clay itself tells a story of the local landscape, tempered with crushed shell or sand to prevent cracking in the heat. When we look at these fragments, we see the echoes of communal meals, the storage of precious seeds for the next planting, and the artistic impulses of a people who found beauty in the utility of their kitchenware. But the soil also holds more violent memories, hidden among the roots of the wild sunflowers. For centuries, the exact location of the battle between Juan de Oñate's Spanish expedition and the Escanjaks, the fierce rivals of the Etzanoans, remained a matter of debate and legend. The written accounts of the Spaniards spoke of a massive settlement and a desperate conflict, but the physical proof remained elusive until the modern era. Then, the metal detectors began to sing. Buried just inches below the surface, researchers found the unmistakable signatures of 17th century European warfare. They unearthed lead bullets, known as harquebus balls, and the small iron grapeshot fired from Spanish cannons. These were not scattered randomly. They were clustered in a specific area that matched the strategic movements described in the Spanish journals. Finding these munitions was like finding a smoking gun in a cold case 4 centuries old. It confirmed that the battle had indeed taken place right here, on the edges of this great city. The presence of these metal artifacts, so foreign to the stone and bone tools of the indigenous population, marks the precise moment when two vastly different worlds collided in a flash of gunpowder and steel. And yet, it is often the humblest finds that provide the most profound insights into the rhythm of life in Etzanoa. Archaeologists pay special attention to the middens, the ancient trash pits where the residents discarded the remnants of their daily existence. In the world of archaeology, one person's waste is another's treasure map. These pits are dense with biological data, a layered history of what the Etzanoans ate and how they interacted with their environment. Within these dark, organic-rich deposits, scientists have found the charred remains of maize, beans, and squash, the 3 sisters of indigenous agriculture that formed the backbone of their diet. But the diet of an Etzanoan was far more varied than simple farming. The middens are filled with the bones of bison, deer, and elk, as well as the smaller remains of fish and turtles pulled from the nearby river. There are even the tiny carbonized shells of wild nuts and the seeds of plums and grapes. These layers of debris tell us that Etzanoa was a land of plenty, a place where the bounty of the earth was harvested with skill and foresight. The sheer volume of the animal remains suggests a society capable of organizing massive communal hunts, a feat that required complex social structures and deep cooperation. Through the study of stratigraphy, the analysis of these layers of earth like the pages of a book, we can see how the city breathed. We see periods of immense prosperity and times of environmental stress. Each layer of wood ash and discarded bone represents a season, a festival, or a quiet family dinner. It is a slow, methodical process of reconstruction where the tiny bones of a bird or the microscopic pollen of a sunflower are treated with the same reverence as a golden coin. The artifacts of Etzanoa remind us that the past is never truly gone. It is merely waiting underfoot. The Gaza points, the pottery shards, the Spanish lead, and the contents of the middens all serve as a bridge across the centuries. They allow us to move beyond the dry words of a conquistador's diary and into the lived reality of a sprawling, vibrant metropolis. As we look at these objects, we are forced to confront the depth of time and the fragility of human achievement. A city of 20,000 people once thrived here, filled with laughter, trade, and the smoke of 1,000 hearths. Today, we hold their world in the palm of our hand, feeling the weight of the ages in a single piece of worked stone, and we wonder how much more remains hidden in the deep, silent shadows of the Kansas soil. The quiet presence of a single flint scraper or a fragment of decorated clay acts as a silent witness, a small but undeniable proof that the vast, rolling prairies of the American Midwest were never the vacant, untamed wilderness so often depicted in our history books. For centuries, a particular narrative has been woven into the fabric of our collective memory, a story of a silent, empty land, waiting for the arrival of the first explorers. But as we stand upon the hidden foundations of Etzanoa, that story begins to dissolve like mist under the morning sun. We are beginning to understand that the heartland of the continent was not a void, but a vibrant tapestry of human connection, a place where the horizon was punctuated not just by the rise of the hills, but by the steady plumes of thousands of cooking fires. This realization shifts our perspective of the Great Plains from a mere corridor of passage to a destination in its own right, a center of gravity for a civilization that understood the rhythms of the earth in ways we are only just beginning to rediscover. When we think of the great urban centers of the ancient world, our minds often drift to the stone temples of the Maya or the sun-drenched plazas of Mesopotamia. Yet here, in the tall grass prairie of Kansas, we find a city that rivaled the contemporary populations of Europe and the East. To envision Etzanoa is to challenge everything we thought we knew about the capacity of the land to sustain such a massive concentration of life. It was a site of immense sophistication, perhaps second only to Cahokia, the great mound city near the Mississippi, in its scale and influence. While Cahokia is often remembered for its towering earthen pyramids, Etzanoa represents a different kind of urban triumph, a sprawling horizontal metropolis that integrated itself seamlessly into the river valleys and the fertile slopes. It was a city that breathed with the landscape, a masterpiece of indigenous urban planning that prioritized the flow of water, the richness of the soil, and the communal bonds of 20,000 souls. The builders of Etzanoa were masters of sustainability long before the word ever entered our modern vocabulary. They did not impose their will upon the earth through rigid grids or stone monuments that defied the elements. Instead, they lived in a rhythmic dance with the Walnut and Arkansas rivers. Their homes, circular and sturdy, were constructed from the gifts of the prairie, willow poles, heavy thatch, and the cooling embrace of the earth itself. As the decades turned into centuries, these people developed a complex system of agriculture that fed a population larger than many colonial capitals would be for hundreds of years to come. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash in the rich alluvial soils, creating a surplus that allowed for the luxury of art, the pursuit of trade, and the development of a social structure that could maintain peace and order across miles of inhabited territory. It was a civilization built on the principle of abundance rather than extraction, a way of life that flourished in harmony with the cycles of the seasons and the migrations of the bison. As we walk through the modern fields, where the corn now grows in straight mechanical rows, it is humbling to realize that the very ground beneath our feet was once a sophisticated network of neighborhoods, workshops, and public squares. The archaeological record reveals a level of organization that is staggering in its quiet efficiency. There were areas dedicated to the mass production of stone tools, where the rhythmic strike of hammerstone against chert created a chorus of industry that echoed through the valley. There were storage pits, deep and cool, that acted as the city's granaries, ensuring that no one went hungry during the lean months of winter. This was not a primitive settlement, but a bustling hub of innovation where ideas were exchanged as freely as the obsidian from the distant mountains or the shells from the far-off Gulf. The heartland was a crossroads, a place where the diverse cultures of the continent met to share in the prosperity of the plains. We must ask ourselves what it means for our understanding of history that such a massive achievement could be so thoroughly forgotten, hidden for centuries beneath the roots of the grass. The myth of the empty wilderness was a convenient one, a narrative that allowed later arrivals to view the land as a blank slate, yet the stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth deposited over time, tells a far more complex tale. Each inch of soil represents a page of a book that was closed and buried. When archaeologists dig into the Kansas earth, they are performing a kind of slow, methodical time travel, peeling back the layers of the present to find the vibrant reality of the past. They find evidence of a people who were not merely surviving, but thriving. A people who had solved the problems of urban living, waste management, and social cohesion long before the first European footfall in the region. The scale of Etzanoa forces us to reconsider the human geography of North America. If a city of 20,000 could exist here, in a place we once considered a desolate frontier, then how many other metropolises lie waiting to be discovered? We are forced to confront the limits of our own knowledge and the biases that have shaped our view of the past. The Great Plains were not a barrier to be crossed, but a garden to be tended, a place where civilization reached a pinnacle of balance and beauty. The silence of the prairie today is not the silence of a land that was always empty. It is the silence of a long-abandoned stage, where the echoes of a grand performance still linger for those who know how to listen. As the wind ripples through the grass, it carries the faint, ghostly memory of a time when this was the center of the world, a place of power, prayer, and profound connection to the mystery of existence. In the quiet moments of the evening, when the light turns gold and the shadows stretch long across the fields, the weight of these forgotten ages feels almost tangible. We realize that we are merely the latest inhabitants of a landscape that has seen the rise and fall of giants. The realization that the heartland was a center of civilization changes the way we see the very soil we walk upon. It is no longer just dirt and rock, but a repository of human dreams and achievements. The story of Etzanoa is a reminder that even the greatest cities can vanish, leaving behind only the most delicate traces of their existence. A few pieces of stone, a handful of seeds, and a lingering sense of wonder. We are left to ponder the fragility of our own structures, our own cities, and the enduring strength of the earth that eventually reclaims them all, keeping their secrets safe in the deep, dark layers of time. The sound of a single word, spoken in the soft cadence of the Wichita language, carries within it a resonance that outlasts any stone monument or iron blade. For centuries, while the physical remnants of Etzanoa lay hidden beneath the tall grass and the tilled soil of Kansas, the memory of a great gathering place lived on in the quiet stories told by elders to their grandchildren. These were not mere myths or flights of fancy, but a living map of the past, preserved through the rhythmic repetition of oral tradition. And so, the rediscovery of the city was not so much a finding of something lost, but a confirmation of what the Wichita people had known in their hearts all along, that their ancestors had built a civilization of staggering scale and sophisticated harmony. Today, the modern Wichita and affiliated tribes look upon the fields of Arkansas City not as a cold archaeological site, but as a sacred landscape where the breath of their forebears still lingers in the wind. The connection is a profound and unbroken thread, stretching back through the era of the Great Plains, through the hardships of relocation, and back to the golden age of the 17th century. When the lead shot and the stone scrapers were pulled from the earth, they acted as physical anchors for the stories that had been whispered in the dark for generations. The archaeological record, with its precise stratigraphy and carbon dating, finally aligned with the ancient narratives of a place where the houses were as numerous as the stars, and the smoke of 10,000 fires rose to meet the morning sky. As the years pass, this rediscovery has sparked a quiet but powerful cultural revitalization within the Wichita Nation. There is a renewed sense of gravity in the old songs, and a deeper meaning found in the traditional crafts that mirror the artifacts recovered from the soil. The land itself is being treated with a new level of reverence as efforts to preserve and protect the site gain momentum. It is a delicate balance, to study the past without disturbing the peace of those who rest there. Preservation is not just about keeping the ground from being paved over. It is about honoring the spiritual weight of a place where 20,000 souls once lived, loved, and dreamed. The Wichita people are working alongside researchers to ensure that the story of Etzanoa is told with dignity, ensuring that the narrative belongs first and foremost to the descendants of those who built it. There is a certain beauty in the way the earth holds on to its secrets until the moment is exactly right. For a long time, the academic world looked for the great cities of the Americas in the jungles of the South or the canyons of the West, overlooking the vast, rolling plains of the Midwest. But the silence of the Kansas prairies was never empty. It was simply waiting. The importance of oral tradition in this process cannot be overstated. While science provides the what and the when, the stories of the Wichita provide the why and the who. They remind us that the people of Etzanoa were not just data points in a study of population density, but a vibrant community with complex social structures, deep religious convictions, and a mastery of the environment that allowed them to thrive for centuries. Meanwhile, the work of preservation continues, guided by the understanding that some things are too precious to be fully excavated. There is a growing movement to leave much of the city undisturbed, allowing the ancestors to remain in the embrace of the earth they knew so well. This approach acknowledges the limits of our own understanding and the humility required when touching the remnants of a lost world. We are beginning to see that the legacy of Etzanoa is not found in a museum display case, but in the resilience of the Wichita people themselves, who have carried the essence of this metropolis through the trials of history. The city lives on in the language, in the traditional dances, and in the collective memory of a nation that refused to let its history be erased by the drifting sands of time. As we contemplate this enduring connection, we are reminded of the fluidity of time. To the ancestors, the city was a bustling reality of noise and color. To the archaeologist, it is a puzzle of flint and bone. And to the modern Wichita, it is a source of pride and a bridge to a heritage that was never truly lost. The landscape of Kansas is no longer just a stretch of farmland to those who know the story. It is a monument to human achievement and a testament to the fact that greatness does not always require high walls or towering spires. Sometimes the most enduring legacy is the one written in the hearts of the people, passed down from one generation to the next, until the earth finally yields its evidence to match the truth of the spoken word. The mystery of Etzanoa invites us to listen more closely to the voices of the past that still echo in the present. It teaches us that the ground beneath our feet is thick with the layers of those who came before, and that our own story is just one more chapter in a very long and ancient book. As the sun sets over the Arkansas River, casting long shadows across the fields where the great city once stood, there is a sense of peace in knowing that the ancestors are no longer forgotten. Their city has returned to the light, not as a ruin to be plundered, but as a sacred legacy to be cherished and protected for all the years to come. In the quiet of the evening, one can almost hear the distant hum of a 20,000-person metropolis, a ghost of a civilization that reminds us of the strength of community and the eternal nature of home. The water of the Walnut River moves with a slow, deliberate grace, carving a path through the soft earth of Kansas just as it has for thousands of years. It is a patient traveler, indifferent to the rise and fall of the empires that have lined its banks, yet it remains the singular witness to everything that has transpired here. If one stands perfectly still along the muddy edge, the only sounds are the rhythmic lapping of the current against the reeds and the occasional rustle of cottonwood leaves in the wind, a sound that bridges the gap between the 16th century and the present day. The river carries the same silt, reflects the same pale blue sky, and provides the same life-giving coolness that once sustained a metropolis of 20,000 souls. It is a liquid thread of continuity, weaving together the disparate eras of human history into a single flowing narrative that never truly ends. Beneath the surface of the dark, rich soil, a quiet coexistence unfolds. In the stratigraphy of these fields, that vertical map of time where layers of earth act as pages in a book, there is no conflict between the past and the present. A rusted iron nail from a pioneer's cabin might rest only inches away from a carefully flaked church scraper used by an Etzanoan woman 400 years ago. Deeper still, the earth holds the memory of even older peoples, their presence marked by the faint chemical signatures of ancient hearths and the discarded remnants of long-forgotten meals. The soil does not discriminate. It gathers every story, every footstep, and every breath, pressing them into the dark loam until they become part of the very foundation of the land. It is a humbling thought to realize that the ground we walk upon is thick with the residue of those who came before, that every handful of Kansas earth is a mosaic of lives lived, dreams pursued, and communities built in the shadow of the Great Plains. As the modern world continues its busy pace, with tractors turning the soil and cars humming along distant highways, the hidden city of Etzanoa remains a silent partner in the landscape. There is a profound sense of wonder in knowing that a vast urban center, once pulsing with the energy of trade, laughter, and the complex rhythms of urban life, is tucked away just beneath the roots of the prairie grass. We often think of history as something distant and detached, a series of dates in a dusty volume, but here history is tactile. It is the weight of a stone tool in the palm of one's hand. It is the unexpected curve of a ceramic shard catching the light after a spring rain. These fragments are more than just archaeological data. They are echoes of a human connection that spans the centuries, reminding us that the desire for companionship and the need for a place to call home are among the most enduring qualities of our species. One cannot help but wonder about the stories that remain untold, the thousands of individual lives that have been absorbed into the silence of the fields. What were the names of the children who played along these banks? What songs were sung during the harvest, and what prayers were whispered to the wind when the summer storms rolled across the horizon? The evidence of their existence is found in the physical, the post-molds of their houses and the debris of their workshops, but their essence remains a mystery, a beautiful shadow that moves just beyond the reach of our understanding. This mystery does not diminish the significance of Etzanoa. Rather, it enhances it, casting the city as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in a vast and often unpredictable world. The endurance of community is perhaps the most striking lesson left behind by the people of the Walnut River. They built something magnificent in a place that many early European explorers dismissed as a wasteland, proving that the heart of a civilization lies not in its monuments of stone, but in the strength of its social bonds. Etzanoa was a place of gathering, a crossroads where different cultures met and shared ideas, and that spirit of cooperation is etched into the very geography of the region. Even now, as archaeologists slowly piece together the layout of the streets and the distribution of the neighborhoods, the image that emerges is one of harmony, a society that understood its place within the natural world and thrived by honoring the resources the river provided. As we look across the quiet fields today, we see more than just a landscape of agriculture and industry. We see a sacred space where the ancestors of the Wichita people once looked out at the same horizon, perhaps feeling the same sense of awe at the immense scale of the sky. The rediscovery of Etzanoa is not merely a scientific achievement, it is a homecoming. It is the restoration of a missing chapter in the American story, a reminder that the history of this continent is far deeper and more complex than we were once led to believe. The Great American Desert, as it was once called by those who did not understand it, was in fact a garden, a thriving, bustling center of human achievement that flourished for generations before the first Spanish hoofbeat echoed in the distance. The legacy of Etzanoa teaches us to look more closely at the world around us, to consider the hidden depths that lie beneath the mundane. It encourages a gentle curiosity about the ground we occupy and the people who might have loved these same hills and valleys long before our names were ever spoken. There is a comfort in this continuity, a feeling that we are never truly alone in time. We are part of a long, unbroken procession of humanity, each generation leaving its mark, however faint, upon the skin of the earth. And so the fields remain quiet, cradling the secrets of the 20,000, while the Walnut River continues its long journey toward the sea, carrying the memory of the lost city in every drop of its dark, patient water. The shadows grow long across the tall grass, and the air turns cool as the day begins to fold into the evening. In this soft, liminal light, the boundaries between the past and the present seem to thin. The modern fences and power lines fade into the periphery, leaving only the contours of the land, the gentle rises where the houses once stood, and the low-lying areas where the gardens once bloomed. It is a time for reflection, for acknowledging the fleeting nature of our own moment in the sun and the enduring strength of the earth that outlasts us all. The story of Etzanoa is a reminder that even the greatest of cities can be reclaimed by the soil, but it is also a promise that nothing is ever truly lost. As long as there are those who are willing to listen to the whispers of the wind and the stories held within the stones. In the end, we are all temporary tenants of the land, passing through a world that has been shaped by the hands of millions who came before. The people of Etzanoa knew the rhythms of the seasons, the patterns of the stars, and the temperament of the river. They knew the warmth of a shared fire and the security of a well-built wall. As we leave these quiet fields to their slumber, we take with us a renewed sense of connection to the deep history of our home. We carry the knowledge that beneath our feet a great city sleeps, its heart still beating in the slow, steady pulse of the Kansas prairie. It is a legacy of peace, a testament to the power of community, and a gentle reminder that the ancestors are always with us, watching over the land they once transformed into a masterpiece of human life.